Okay, I've got my speed trains here all cleaned and I've lubricated them with graphite powder. I'm going to fit them back in the shutter. I'll cock that, cock the shutter there, and I can drop in the retard gear train. Held in place with two screws. This is the pivot screw at this end. I'm going to pull this lever back so that it catches behind the tab on the blade actuating ring, not just sitting on top of it, otherwise it'll get damaged. That screw goes in here. And that screw passes through an enlarged hole in the bottom of the speed train. Just tip that out and get it back in place, which allows you to do some adjustments. It means you can move the speed train for greater or lesser engagement with the main cam. With the speed train swung towards the centre of the shutter, you get greater engagement with the cam, and with the speed train moved towards the case, the outside case, you get less engagement. There's not much movement there, but there's enough to make quite a significant difference to these speeds. We've got a good spring in here now, so this is going to be positioned pretty much close to the centre of this shutter towards the lens tube. If it was a very weak spring, you might have it positioned further out. Here's the retard gear, the self-timer rather. Getting this seated is sometimes a bit of an act. Held in place with a single screw at this end. And it seats into a hole in the mechanism plate at this end. The screw head on the opposite side of this post seats into a hole in the mechanism plate. It's often awkward to get it to seat. I can't pick that screw up. That's better. Yeah, just dropped in. With the screws all in place, I can cock the shutter. Set the self-timer, hold down this latch here, move the arm, self-timer is set. We release the shutter, it's dropped down to the self-timer. The self-timer would be operated and run down like this, and as the self-timer runs down it will pull back that tab, releasing the shutter. So that's all go. I don't know what the speeds are like they're probably pretty good. I've checked the position of those screws and they're all tight. Now give this lever here, I'm just going to give that a wipe with molybdenum paste on the tip in case I forgot to do that earlier. Just there. That's where the main cam latch is round it. And that's just so it'll latch in and release smoothly. Okay, so this piece goes on next. This section couples to the pinion, and the pinion cocks the main cam, but it also couples to this piece by the gear, and this cocks this ring, and this ring cocks that piece and sets the shutter for all practical purposes. So I'm just wiping around the outside and inside edges of that with some molybdenum paste, and you need very little indeed. Now the spring on this, the end of this spring hooks over this post. I can swing that into position. So you can see that it abuts the screw head here, and the tab on the self timer is pulled back by this piece here. So there's the tab on the self timer. Here's the cocking shaft for the main cam, in fact for the entire shutter. I just gave the stem of that a very light wipe of molybdenum paste, and I'll fit this into position. Take note of the position of the teeth. The first tooth on the wheel here drops into the first notch on the ring there, making sure that's not trapped under there. I'll fit the speed settings cam plate in place. I'll give this a wipe with molybdenum paste through there, around the outside edge, particularly these lumps and bumps where it sets the retard gear train. On the underside surface, where you see these notches, a wipe there is useful because this runs against the top of the case and you will get quite a bit of friction otherwise. Then this sits in position about here. Make sure that the V lever is not trapped underneath it, and then put the retaining ring in place. This just clips into position. Now we can check the speeds of the shutter. I'll just cock it by pulling this back. Set this to an 1/8 of a second, which I happen to know is there, and see what sort of result I get. It didn't sound 100 miles away. I'll see what the 15th sounds like. They sound reasonable. I can check those on my shutter speed tester, and if they're okay we can continue closing up the shutter, and if not I can adjust it. The speeds would be adjusted by moving the retard gear train. I've already mentioned that the screw here allows adjustment. If the speeds are too slow, we loosen that screw and move the speed train slightly outwards towards the case, and only very slight movements required. Retighten the screw, check again. If the speeds are too fast, you'd need to loosen the screw and move the retard gear train inwards for greater engagement with the main cam, which would slow the shutter down slightly. And again, always check that that screw is tightened before you close up the shutter once you've made your adjustments. Back after I've tested it. Well, there was a bit of toing and froing required, but I've got that adjusted nicely now to my satisfaction. So, taking these components, I'm going to put this together. A little fork here goes over that pin, or around that pin. And that little spring is where the detent ball sits for our click stops for the shutter speeds. So I normally put a blob of molybdenum paste on there, which acts as an assembly grease, you could say, to keep the ball in place while I'm putting the shutter into the case. Here's our shutter. It only goes into the case one way. We're interested in this tab here, the one with a little slot in it. That little slot sits over that pin. And I'll just lower this into position. Hopefully the ball stayed where it was put. There are 3 screws hold this in place. Run them lightly down. Because the black circular mask on the other side of the shutter may well not be centered. This allows you to pull it across, make sure it's centered before we do the screws up. And here you can see that it's not centered, it's off center, it's not there, it's just clicked back into place now. You can do the 3 screws up. And I'll just get a bigger driver and tighten those up well. Check that the shutter speed click stops works nicely. That sounds good, feels okay. So far so good. Alright, that's ready to go into the front mount now. We'll pop that to one side. Put the mount back together. If this piece goes on, there's a hole in here, sits over that pin there. This is held together with 4 screws. I've got to pause now, it's feeding time. Get these 4 screws placed. And tighten them up. Right, these screws are prone to coming loose on the Retina IIIS, so I'm going to lock them with a touch of lacquer. This is just cheap nail polish from the bargain store. but it'll certainly do the job. Be a little bit less generous with this one because I don't want it running down underneath that. That'll do. When using lacquer to lock screws, it's traditional to use something bright and eye-catching in areas where it's not going to be seen by the user or owner of the camera, but only by someone repairing the camera, so that it's obvious that the screws have been locked in position, and so that if someone wants to undo the screws easily, they'll know to put some acetone or similar on there in order to make the job easier. Okay, so that's that side. Let's pop that on there. That piece goes on, and then the chrome. Get that centered down inside the black surround, and that's held on with 3 screws from memory. These ones are not prone to coming loose much, and there's nowhere for them to go anyway, so you don't need to lock these ones with lacquer. Okay, I'll put the shutter back on, get that flash cable sitting somewhere useful. Take the shutter, put the little plastic flash contact bush thing on there. Now the shutter is in the released position. Let's line up these marks. That's us there by the looks of things. Got my little arrow heads towards each other, the holes exposed here. The line on this one's running vertical, so I know that that's probably going to fit. If I wriggle the shutter into place, and that drops straight on. We've got 4 screws hold this in place. Let's just pull that flash wire out. That plastic piece is trying to get out of the way. 4 screws hold that on. They've got to be dropped down through these holes. Sometimes they'll drop straight in if you're careful and if you're lucky. Like that. Other times they'll fall down sideways and they'll be rattling around. This screw, a very dirty head on it, looks like it's got black on there, corrosion I'm not sure, or paint. Just paint. It might be one that I've added from elsewhere. There was the occasional screw missing on these cameras because They're a bit of a mixed bag, these three cameras. Let's just drop down into position. It's not worth wasting too much time trying to manipulate into position. If you don't get it right the first time, it's easy to just pick the shutter up, drop the screws back out and have another go. Sometimes they'll just shake into position and drop down into the hole. Other times they won't. That one's not going to. These screw heads are a little bit unhappy. They've had a hard life. That one went in. You've already put the screw in that one. Nope. This one here, of course, you're dropping it down through a hole in that gear, so that's one of the reasons it's, well, in fact it's the main reason it's useful to make sure that the gears are positioned so that the hole is exposed. Not today. Okay, so we've got 3 of the 4 screws have dropped into place nicely. This one's just plain hard to get. That's on. Okay, with the 4 screws in position, I can now go around and tighten them up. Now these screws are a little bit prone to coming loose, but they're nowhere you could conveniently put lacquer on the heads of the screws, and I'd be reluctant to put Loctite on the threads of the screws, although that would be an option. Okay, so if I get my flash contact wire in position here, it's not exactly playing the game. Okay, that's now sitting correctly, and I can tighten up the screw. I'll tuck that flash wire down flush inside there. That's the shutter back in the camera. If I rotate that, I can cock the shutter and the shutter fires. So that shutter at that stage, we need our rangefinder coupling put back in there. So that's these three components from the front. The cylindrical piece drops in from the back. The recessed hole in the cylindrical piece goes to the back, and our collet slides in there. Push the collet on until there's about 1/2 millimetre or so of pin exposed past the end of the collet. And that's about the right amount. So with that shutter all back together, that's ready to go on the camera body once the meter and so forth have been put back in place. So I've actually got 4 camera bodies all sitting at the same stage now, waiting for the meters to be put in place. 3 of them have got different pulley arrangements, only slightly, it's only the tensioning pulley, but I'll show you how I get the cord back in place on those 3 cameras. I've got 2 or 3 small video clips taken of the other shutters and the problems I struck with them, all the differences between the shutter on camera number 1 and the others, because camera number 1 was the early model. Here's the shutter from camera number 1. Now I'm not going to show much of this because I expected this shutter to be exactly the same as the other camera. But I'm struck with a difference immediately. There's a difference here in the coupling for the rangefinder. And I want to pull this apart now and see exactly what we've got here. Okay, so we've got an extra piece. This is what we've got. We've got a pin, we've got the tube with the collar on the end, we've got a straight or smooth tube, we've got this piece, but that's got a section on the end of it, and then we've got the collet which holds it in place, holds it all together. How does that compare with a one from a later camera? Well, let's start with this. This is the one from camera number 3. If I can just pull it apart without breaking anything. So here we have a cylindrical section, longer. The collet looks much the same. Our piece here looks much the same. This piece looks much the same. And then we have our pin. So there's certainly a change with the shape of this. It's relieved at the end, and where this one remains solid. I'm not sure why they changed. Well, I suppose if you can skip a machining operation by not relieving it, that would save money. But the other parts look much the same. I'd have to check those closely together to see if there's any differences there. That looks the same. That looks the same. This piece looks the same. The collet looks the same. So we've only got a part, the differences are here. And of course the brass components here have been chemically blackened in some fashion, whereas they didn't bother to chemically blacken them later on. If I see any other differences, I'll let you know. Just for a change, I will lubricate the blade actuating ring on this camera with a bit of molybdenum paste. So basically I'm just going to rub a little bit of molybdenum paste around the centre, and an even smaller amount on the underside of this. Normally I do just lubricate this with graphite powder. Graphite grease was frequently used to do this job, very sparingly applied, or just simply graphite powder, or even graphite from a soft lead pencil. So that's sitting there in place. I'll just put its detent spring in position. And I'll fit the lens tube. The lens tube only goes on in one position. At this tab here, that corner's cut away to allow it to fit up next to that pin or post. Here I've got to make sure that the pallet is not stuck underneath the tab on the lens tube. And check that the levers aren't stuck underneath the blade actuating ring here, or indeed over here. That all looks good. This is the bracket that holds the main drive spring in position. That sits over that post there, and I want the longer of the 3 screws to hold this in position. There are 3 screws, 2 of them are identical, one of them is very slightly longer, and the longer one goes in that position. The 2 shorter ones go here and here. I'll just run those screws down lightly. Check that the blade actuating ring can move. You've got various levers here blocking its action. Yeah, that moves nicely. I'll tighten the 3 screws up. And check the action again. That moves nice and smoothly. That's ideal. I've still got to put some molybdenum paste on the various contact points for the main cam here and here. And at these points here, where as the blade actuating ring opens, it pushes this lever back out of the way. That lever would normally drop down under there under spring tension. The blade actuating ring would lift this out of the way, which releases the flash sync mechanism. And this tab here is where the B lever drops into place to lock the blade actuating ring in the blade's fully open position until you take your finger off, whereupon it can return to the rest position. Okay, so that's all I needed to show you about that. That's just using molybdenum paste instead of using graphite to do the blade actuating ring. I'm working my way through cleaning up the shutter components for camera number 2. I haven't bothered showing you any of the cleaning process on this camera because I'm going to be doing it again shortly anyway. But I've got down to the stage where I'm looking at the shutter blades. Now these shutter blades are all damaged. They've all got a little crease right at this point here, and looking at that, I believe that someone has pushed the shutter blades from the front and pushed them back, and they're all a little bit bent. And if I get the light to play on that correctly, you can just about see it. So they're not dead flat, they've all got a crease running across at this angle, which tells me that the shutter was probably partly open or not far open, and someone's just pressed their finger into it and caused those things to buckle up. So they would work like that, and obviously because the shutter was working to some extent, but they won't work well. Now the shutter, when it was assembled, the blade actuating ring with the blades and things all fitted seemed a little bit stiff. Well, this would certainly explain that. So what I want to try and do is see if I can straighten those blades out. If I can get them to get rid of that obvious little crease, which is right on that front leading edge, I'll be a lot happier. This blade also shows a deformation right here. Now, right on that hole. Now basically that would have happened when someone was reassembling the shutter, and when you put the case back over the blades and go to tighten the screws up, if one of the blades has moved slightly so that it's sitting on top of the pin, the pivot pin, instead of sitting around the pivot pin, that's exactly the sort of problem you get. You get the blade being slightly distorted. Now a little bit won't hurt, you can get away with it, but a lot you certainly don't want. So I'll try and get that crease out too. It's very hard manipulating a crease out of one of these blades, because the blades they're quite a high tensile steel, I believe. They're like, and they certainly, once they've taken a set, they're not very easy to straighten out. This is our cover blade number 6, and I can see the crease extends right from that edge to this edge. These ones it's not so easy to see because I think it falls right at that edge there, and one blade shows hardly anything at all. That's probably blade number 1, and I think it shows not so much because the other blades are, it's not pushing back against the case at that point. It's not pushing back against the mechanism plate. No, it'll be the behind the mechanism plate, because it's sitting on top of these blades, and they're the ones suffering the biggest thumps. So I will try getting those marks out, and if I look like I'm having any success, I'll show you how I do it. Well, I've worked on 2 blades and I'm fairly happy with the result. I can still see that little crease mark there, but it's much reduced and the blade looks flat. So what I've done, if I can get this blade flipped over, I've got the blade flipped over so that little crease is a high spot on this side, and all I've done is taken the back of my tweezers and applied some pressure and rubbed it across that point. And this is on my work mat, and the work mat was reputed to be silicon, but I think that probably it's actually vinyl. But that's quite good. I can't even see that mark from that side of the blade. I can still see a bend across that blade, and there's also this little spot here. I'll see if I can get that to rub to go down. See, the blades are quite hard. I don't know if I've improved that or made it worse. Now I'm just running the tail of my tweezers right across where that fold was, and that blade looks flatter now, so I'll just continue doing that with the last 3 blades, because I did 2 before I stopped to I wanted to make sure that I was having some positive effect really. There's no point teaching you a method that's not going to work. This blade is obviously bent at that point. I can see it's touching the mat here and here, and it's floating at this point. See, it bounces. That's much better, that's much flatter. And these blades, I want to clean these with some brasso metal polish before I clean them. And this one here, it doesn't have a sharp crease to it. This was, I expect that this was blade number 1, but it certainly has a bend running radially across here basically, or circumferentially. I don't know how you say that word. And again, this blade was floating, but now it's sitting flat. So that's just about it for these blades. I think they're going to work nicely without any problem. Here again you can see that the blade is bent. If this end is sitting down, this end's floating in the air. It's got quite a, can't get the light to play on this properly for you so you can see. Yeah, it's got quite a pronounced line across here. At this point, it's definitely bent there, and I can see a crease on the blade at this edge and here, and the crease runs in a curve like this. It's sharpest on that leading edge. Well, that's sitting flatter on the mat now. It's better. I'd like to say it was invisible. It's not invisible, but it's greatly improved. So I think that's all my blades. And I'm just checking to see that they sit flat on the surface. That one's not. That one needs work. Yeah, this is a bit finely balanced, because if the mat was absolutely rigid, there'd be no flex happening there where I'm applying the pressure, and therefore there'd be no straightening action. And if the mat was too soft, there'd probably be too much flex at that point. That blade there needs some attention. That's good. So my blades are sitting flat to the surface now. I think they'll work very well. I'll check them over once more, make sure I'm happy with them, and then I'm going to polish these with brasso, which will take off some of those surface marks. These aren't badly marked by any means, but any shutter that's open to the atmosphere, one that you can expose the shutter blades by removing the lens, they're prone to getting dirt and dust, the occasional fingerprint, and anything else on the blades. And because they're open to the atmosphere too, and they're probably prone to corrosion more than blades that are trapped between a front and rear lens group. Because blades trapped between a front and rear lens group more typically are going to have oils that have vaporised elsewhere in the shutter settling on those blades, which would have a protective effect in terms of avoidance of corrosion. Right, so that's all I needed to show you about those blades. I'm quite happy with the state of those now. The other components of the shutter I've cleaned, and this camera number 2 is all in pieces, all cleaned up and ready for reassembly, and I'll reassemble this at the same time I reassemble camera number 1 and 3, so that I can show you any differences. I expect there'll be differences between cameras 1 and 2 and 3, but cameras 2 and 3 are probably going to be very similar.